From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Luke Jones. This is shaping up to be the biggest terrorism trial in modern German history.
On Wednesday morning, some 3,000 police raided more than 100 properties in several German states and arrested 25 people, all of them suspected members or supporters of the so-called Reichsbürger movement. Their goal, a coup d'etat in Germany. They wanted to overthrow democracy.
Later this month, the ringleaders, including a 72-year-old self-styled aristocrat, will face a trial in Stuttgart. But what can this curious fringe failure tell us about the mainstream far-right success?
They came in their tens of thousands. In towns and cities across Germany, huge crowds rising up against the far right.
And the memory of what has happened before. The AfD is currently second in polls ahead of next month's European elections. The story today: Germany's rising far right again.
My name's Peter Conradi. I'm the Europe editor of the Sunday Times.
How long have you covered Germany for? Has it been a while?
I've been based in Paris covering Europe for the past 5 years and have been backwards and forwards a lot to the country. I was a student there back in the 1980s, and I've kind of covered it on and off in the years since as a journalist.
Sprechen Sie Deutsch?
Ja.
Oh, come on, you can do better than that.
Ich kann viel mehr sagen. Also was willst du hören? Was willst du von mir hören? Was sollte ich dir sagen?
And did you pick that up as a student? Is that when you learned?
Yes, and I also worked in Germany a lot. I've worked in Switzerland and various other places.
Tell us about this bizarre case, a trial of which is going to start in a week or so's time. A real ragtag bunch of people accused of an attempted coup. What did this plot allegedly involve?
Well, this is being billed as the biggest terror plot in post-war German history. What we have is 27 people who are going on trial, or rather they're going on 3 trials, because this trial is so big that it's having to be split into 3 parts. And they're being accused of planning to topple the government of Chancellor Olaf Scholz and put themselves in power in his place.
And who is involved? They're quite an interesting bunch.
The alleged ringleader, or certainly the figurehead of the plot, is an elderly German nobleman, I suppose one could call him, called Heinrich XIII Prince Reuss, who is a member of the family that used to run an area of southeastern Germany in Thuringia until the First World War. More recently, he's been dabbling in property, a bit of a businessman, slightly strange figure, to put it mildly, now aged 72. When he was young, he apparently dreamt of becoming a Formula One driver, had a few accidents, that didn't quite happen. But he also has very, very extreme political views. And he has been sucked into sort of right-wing conspiracy theories and rather vague kind of group called the Reichsbürger, literally the citizens of the Reich, who don't believe in the legitimacy of the post-war German government and essentially hark back to the time of the Kaiser.
And this isn't a bunch of misfits in a pub somewhere chatting about, oh, wouldn't it be great if we overthrew the government? The allegation is there was actually quite detailed planning that went into it.
Yes, there was detailed planning, and the alarming thing is that the group also included quite a lot of, one would think, serious people with a military background and access to weapons. One of the other leading co-conspirators is a guy called Maximilian Eder, who was the co-founder of something called the KSK, which is a German military group, sort of reminiscent of the British SAS. There was another retired lieutenant colonel called Rüdiger von Pescatore, also with links to a number of military men, both serving and former. And also a member of parliament, now a former member of parliament, called Birgit Malsack-Winkelmann, who represents the AfD, the Alternative für Deutschland, a kind of a far-right political party, who was also allegedly in on the conspiracy.
And they were key because they could get into the Reichstag. And if their plot was partly to storm the Reichstag at some point, that's very useful to have somebody with a pass.
It was indeed, yes. Mrs. Malsack-Winkelmann allegedly took a group of the plotters on a tour of the Reichstag building in which the current German parliament sits in August 2021. And, they didn't only inspect the obvious places that a tourist might inspect, but they started going to the underground car park, looking at the various entrances. It was a little bit like, modern-day Guy Fawkes leading conspirators down through the cellars of the Houses of Parliament.
And interesting things were found in this now former MP's house as part of the investigations.
When the police arrested her in their flat, they found that she had a semi-automatic rifle, a revolver, a bulletproof vest, night vision goggles, and an expandable baton. Not the kind of stuff that you would expect a member of the parliament, who incidentally was also herself a judge, to be keeping at home.
And this attempted coup, this group, as alleged, aren't strictly involved with the AfD, Germany's far-right party. It is proper fringe loony stuff, as alleged, but having this clear link between the two, a now former AfD MP, a current AfD MP at the time, and this group, how troublesome is that for the party? And how strong is the link, I guess, between the AfD and the kind of people who would have got behind an organisation like this?
I think in current German politics there's a kind of a continuum that runs from the AfD, some of whose members have views which are probably not that much more extreme than those of some in the British Conservative Party. So you have sort of one side, and at the other side you have these real conspiracy theorists who believe in all manner of alien plots and the other kind of stuff that you might find in the murkier reaches of the internet. But, there is an overlap between them. So we have Mrs. Malsack-Winkelmann, who was a member of the AfD and was part of the plot. A number of other people who are members of the AfD also appear to have been implicated or sympathetic towards its ideas. It's an embarrassment for the AfD to some extent. But that being said, they've got other more immediate problems, which involve accusations of some of their members being rather too friendly with the Russians, with the Chinese, perhaps even taking money from them. So far, this doesn't really seem to be particularly hurting them.
The AfD is getting more and more popular, it seems, at the moment. You went to a rally that the party held in the state of Thuringia, which is where Heinrich Prince Reuss's ancestors ruled over at one point. What did you find when you got there? What was the rally like?
Well, I think the thing across lots of what used to be communist East Germany is quite how much support, bizarrely, there is for the AfD, particularly in Thuringia, which is, a fairly small, sparsely populated, largely kind of wooded state close to the border with the Czech Republic. Now, I went along there to a rally being held by a gentleman called Björn Höcke, who is the head of the AfD in Thuringia and who is also one of the more extreme members of the party. Bizarrely, the title of the talk was The Threat to Democracy in Germany. And you would have thought, well, this is a party which is got some fairly dubious people in its ranks. It's been closely watched by the German intelligence services because of the suspicion, basically, of what these people are up to, of sort of that they have links with various extremist neo-Nazi groups and whatever. But instead, the whole discussion was essentially how the German state is a threat to democracy, how the German state is spying on its people.
In einer Demokratie darf es keine Gesinnungsschnüffelei geben. In Großbritannien gibt es keinen Inlandsgeheimdienst, der die Gesinnung von Menschen ausschnüffelt.
He launched into all sorts of accusations linked to the measures that were taken during the COVID epidemic to control people's access to buildings on the basis of whether they've been vaccinated or not.
Wir können uns noch gut erinnern, wie die Regierung damals die Angst der Menschen geschürt hat. Wir können uns gut erinnern, wie die rigiden Eingriffe in unsere Grund- und Freiheitsrechte begründet wurden mit der Gefährlichkeit dieses Virus.
These kind of issues. The people inside, who queued for quite a long time to go and see him, were, to be honest, not a very threatening-looking bunch. It was more sort of checked shirts rather than black shirts. They were mostly in their 60s, I would say, fairly calm. One didn't feel one was at Nuremberg in 1933, but they were deeply unhappy with the way Germany was going, and they were really enthusiastic about Höcke.
Peter, you've taken us through this, well, first of all, the strange case of this would-be attempted coup involving a prince, some former military types, and a now former Member of Parliament for the AfD party. One of many embarrassing stories for that far-right party trying to make itself seem less neo-Nazi and more appealing to voters. Can you tell us a bit more about the party itself? You were telling us about a rally that you went to recently, but the party itself, intriguingly, isn't that old at all.
No, the AfD was founded about a decade ago by a group of academics, actually, who were upset at the way that Germany was being involved in the bailout of some of the southern European countries in the aftermath of the financial crisis and then the Eurozone crisis that we saw around 2008, 9, 10. And, for a couple of years or so, it didn't make a great progress at the polls. People used to laugh about it. They used to call it the Professor's Party. But that all changed in 2015 when there was this mass influx of people from Syria, from elsewhere in the Middle East, into Europe. More than 1 million people arrived in Germany. Angela Merkel, the then Chancellor, effectively opened the doors to them.
We have made it clear that those who arrive in Germany have a very high likelihood of being granted asylum and the status of refugees fleeing civil war. Considering the situation in Syria, that shouldn't come as a surprise and should really similarly be the case in every European country.
Initially, they were given a great welcome. Then certain people began to turn against them. And that began to fuel the rise of this party, which started to grow and grow and grow in the polls. It hasn't been a sort of a steady upward rise, there have been ups and downs, but then it got another boost from COVID, from the various restrictions that the government in Germany introduced. And in the European Parliament elections due next month, it's predicted to get about 16 to 18% of the vote across Germany as a whole, but as much as 30% of the vote in large parts of the former communist East.
And is that where they're most popular?
They are. I mean, that's where their stronghold is, and where also, crucially, this autumn, there will be elections in 3 of the states, the so-called Länder, that make up Germany, where they could be getting on for 1 in 3 of the votes. And even if they won't get into the government, because the other parties will probably all conspire to keep them out, they will form a very, very powerful opposition bloc.
And what are their policies on the face of it? I mean, someone like Björn Höcke, the chair of the party in Thuringia that you were telling us about at that rally, what kind of policy platform was he laying out?
Their policies are probably not dissimilar to the various far-right parties that one sees across continental Europe, whether the National Rally Party of Marine Le Pen in France or Giorgia Meloni's Brothers of Italy party and the equivalents in Scandinavia. It's essentially anti-migrant, in favour of a small state, very, very wary about any kind of green policies, a kind of a scepticism about climate change. And there are also various other kind of fringe things that they throw in. They're very keen on using cash, and they don't like this sort of move to a cashless society. In the German context, though, what makes it particularly alarming, I think, is German history and their attitude to the past. Because Normally speaking, these kind of right-wing parties consider themselves to be patriotic, consider themselves to be kind of nationalist. In Germany's case, there is a section of the past, namely the period when Hitler was in power, that is not so glorious, which obviously leaves them with a problem. So, they don't go as far as to defend Nazism. That would immediately land them in jail in Germany and would also rightly put off a lot of voters. What they do is they try to downplay it. There's a whole series of quotes from Höcke and from other leading figures in the party in which they say, well, this was essentially only a short period in German history. We've moved on since then. We're too obsessed with the past. We should stop banging on about the Holocaust. That kind of discussion, which unfortunately seems to resonate with a number of their voters.
Actually, he himself, Höcke, has found himself in hot water for aping Nazi slogans, although he says unintentionally.
I have been on this earth for 51 years. I'm a father of 4 and was a teacher for 15 years. I have never come into conflict with the law. I've always been a law-abiding citizen, and now I'm standing in front of the large criminal chambers of the state of Saxony-Anhalt and the state of Thuringia, where normally rapists and murderers are sentenced for an opinion crime.
He has indeed, yes. I mean, he is currently on trial for having used a phrase which is alles für Deutschland, everything for Germany. Sounds innocuous enough. He used it during one of his speeches, but the problem is that this was a slogan that was used by the Nazis, and under German law, simply uttering this phrase, particularly if you do so in a public space during a political speech, is an offence.
You said earlier, geographically, that they're popular in the former communist East, but demographically, do we know who they play well with?
Demographically, their support tends to be spread fairly evenly across different age groups. They tend to be more popular with men than they are with women. Typically, they're much more popular in small towns, in rural areas, than they are in big cities like Berlin or even Leipzig or Dresden in the former East. So, this is clearly not the hipsters' party. This is a sort of a traditional conservative people that feel that they've been kind of left behind, I think, by what's going on in the world, by political correctness, by woke ideology, the usual kind of thing that one would expect, and the usual kind of people that support these kind of parties across Europe.
So you've got Höcke, who is the chair of the party in Thuringia, on trial for essentially using a Nazi slogan. You've got a former MP of the AfD facing trial in its enormous trial, as you say, the biggest terrorist plot since the Second World War. How successfully are they shaking off the idea that they're a bunch of Nazis?
These things are certainly not helpful for the party and for its image, but even more concerning, I think, are revelations that have been appearing in recent weeks about links between the AfD and both China and Russia. Now, the party has long been sympathetic towards both countries. When it comes to the war in Ukraine, for example, they have little sympathy for the Ukrainians. They don't want Germany to be supplying arms to the Ukrainians, and they essentially want a ceasefire, even if it's on Putin's terms. They're also quite sympathetic towards China. What has been embarrassing have been these claims that people linked with the party have actually been taking money from the Chinese and have been taking money from the Russians. I don't think that they are seen as being neo-Nazis as such, but they are certainly seen as being on the extreme of German politics. And the rest of the German political parties, don't want to have anything to do with them. They've maintained what they call a firewall against them.
And how typical of the party is what Höcke was saying at that rally? You met the AfD's deputy leader, who it seemed was obviously backed him, but seemed a bit frustrated by how far he'd occasionally take things. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, Höcke himself is very much on the right of the party.
On the right of the far-right party.
He is indeed. And he poses a bit of a problem for the leadership of the party because he is very popular among supporters, but he's also a bit of an embarrassment, and he rather undermines their claim that they are just basically a traditional conservative party which is trying to do what the Christian Democrats, the party of Angela Merkel, used to do. And so they have tried in the past to actually throw him out of the party when he appears to have gone too far. They never quite succeeded. And if he does win the election in Thuringia in September, as he's expected to, then they will undoubtedly bank the gain.
And the security services as well. I think you mentioned that they see them as, or at least see parts of them as, extreme, the AfD. What does that mean in terms of how the security services deal with them, manage them, surveil them?
Well, the German security services, the kind of the equivalent of MI5, certainly are watching them very, very closely indeed. They have a sort of a system of classifications that they apply to political groups, but certain sections of it, including Höcke's party in Thuringia, are seen as confirmed extremist, and that means that essentially they are being watched very closely, their phones are being tapped, the security services are collecting information about them and monitoring very carefully who's joining.
Which must feed into their point that the German state is against them and is some malign force trying to stop them. I mean, is there a debate going on about how you handle a party like this and whether there's a possibility that by going too far in either surveilling them or clamping down on them, they can actually fuel them?
Well, that's a very good point because, say, last summer, as the party was getting stronger, a debate began to start in Germany about whether or not the party should be banned. And certain influential political figures, including even the president, hinted that they thought it wouldn't be a bad idea if the party were banned. But, that itself is a very, very complicated process. It's only been done twice in the past to real fringe parties, and that was back in the 1950s. And there is a broader political discussion to be had, or a kind of a discussion about individual liberty to be had, which says, can you seriously think of banning a political party which has the support of something like 20% of the population? Should you not actually be combating them on the political stage? Should you not be debating with them? Should you not be calling them out, criticizing their policies in the same way as you would any other political party?
Because I guess the concern must be that if you end up having a Germany which can't have a hard right party, like a Giorgia Meloni of Italy or a Nigel Farage and Reform in terms of what we have in the UK, that energy then gets channeled into far right politics. If you stop yourself from being able to have a populist hard right, you end up fueling the far right.
You do indeed. But again, the problem is, where does the populist right end and the far right begin? All sorts of people from this kind of far right, skinhead, as if they were kind of conspiracy theorist scene, have found their way into the party. And as we saw with the Reichsbürger plot, there are links between the two. You can't sort of seal off a party against infiltration from the far right. So it does become all part of this rather weird kind of cocktail.
That was Sunday Times Europe editor Peter Conradi, and you can read more on the Reichsbürger trial, as well as his recent long read on the AfD, at thetimes.co.uk, if and only if you're a Times subscriber. The producer today was Ed Halford, the executive producers were Fiona Leach and Edward Drummond, and sound design and theme composition was by Mauro Seto. Let us know what you made of all of this. The story at thetimes.co.uk is our email. Eager and waiting for your tips, opinions, suggestions, criticisms, whatever you like. Goodbye.